if there's a core message in the book, it's that this is an inherently political project and moment. That's the thing about emergencies like wars or climate. We don't win them alone. We don't win them as individuals. They're inherently collective.
Hey there. Thanks for joining for another episode of Impact in the 21st Century, a podcast by Simbi Foundation, which celebrates the impactful work being done around the globe and shares the stories of the inspiring individuals who are behind it. My name's Aaron, and I'm the host of Impact in the 21st Century. In this series, we're focusing on the people working to protect our natural world, innovate greener technologies, and ensure that no one's left behind in the process. In each episode, I'll be speaking with an impactful author, founder, activist, or changemaker about the actions they're taking in this space. And in doing so, I also aim to tease out what we can all be doing to lead more impactful lives. But before we get into today's episode, let me tell you about something I'm deeply passionate about, Simbi Foundation, a non-profit organization working in collaboration with the United Nations to enhance access to education in refugee settlements in Uganda. Simbi Foundation builds bright boxes, solar-powered classrooms built from shipping containers that provide educational technology, digital learning material, and sustainable energy through a microgrid to entire schools and communities. If you'd like to learn more, feel free to visit simbifoundation.org. And if you'd like to support Simbi Foundation and our podcast, we welcome you to like and subscribe to help more people discover the podcast. On the show today, Seth Klein, Director of Strategy of the Climate Emergency Unit and author of the book, A Good War, Mobilizing Canada for the Climate Emergency. Seth, thank you so much for joining. And how are you doing today? And where are you joining from?
Nice to be with you, Aaron. Thanks for the invite. I am on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, like you, apparently, otherwise known as Vancouver. Good to be here.
Great to have you. You know, I've been looking forward to this conversation, and I'm sure you know we're recording the podcast episode just barely a week after the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Latest report tells us once again that we're just not doing enough, and we're not doing enough quickly enough. And we're not going to be on track to essentially make a tangible difference in curbing our energy emissions. And these findings from the report have obviously been spotlighted in international media. And it's made me think that, you know, given that we're not moving enough and with enough intention, it just seems so timely that we're having this conversation on the backdrop of this urgency. And, you know, in speaking with you, the author of A Good War, Mobilizing Canada for the Climate Emergency, the book outlines a harder and faster approach and what that could really look like. And I'd love for you to just share for folks who have not yet read the book, what are the 4 or 5 major items, major topics that we can be doing to address this emergency harder and faster?
Right. Well, I mean, first of all, to go back to your point about the IPCC, it has been these IPCC reports, among others, that were part of why I changed focus in my own career to focus on climate and to write this book, and because I was increasingly alarmed and a bit panicked about this harrowing gap between what the science says we have to do and what our politics seems prepared to entertain. We live in an era of disconnect, and where our politicians, for the most part, with some notable exceptions, they don't deny the reality of human-induced climate change, but they practice, and this is a core idea in the book, they practice something I call the new climate denialism. And what I mean by the new climate denialism is when a leader in government or industry says they get it, but continues to pursue a policy agenda that does not align with what the science says we urgently need to do. And where even as our governments start to slowly bend the curve on our emissions, they are not doing so at nearly the pitch that those IPCC scientists say we have to. So when I set out to write this book, it was to tackle that gap. What do we do to bridge this gap between what the science says and what our politics is willing to do? I had originally in the book outline intended for there to be a single chapter on lessons from the Second World War, because I had long been intrigued by the war as an example of rapid economic transformation. Like for all of us who have this concern, this doubt in our head, that asks, can we really do this wholesale transformation that's necessary in the short window of time that we have? I thought, this is kind of interesting, this war story, because we did, in fact, retool the whole economy in the space of 6 years, twice, once to ramp up military production, another time to reconvert to peacetime. And but then as I started to dig into that research, I started to see more and more parallels, and not just on the economic front, parallels between that emergency 80 years ago and this new emergency around how do you rally the public? How do you forge unity across political divides and regional divides? What's the role of inequality? What's the role of indigenous leadership? What did we do for returning soldiers? And is there a model there for just transition for fossil fuel workers? How did we pay for it? I just started to see more and more connections and parallels, but it was also, I've been on the climate file for the better part of 20 years. It was making me look at that material through fresh eyes, through the lens of emergency. What does it look like and feel like when a society actually treats an emergency like an emergency? So that's the gist of the book. That's the original twist of the book. And the chapters are all, each chapter is part history, part present, around modeling what does cross-society mobilization actually look like.
And what did you discover, or what did you learn along the way that made you change your career and made you decide, I'm going to dedicate a chunk of time to writing this book?
Well, I had been, I was the director of a social justice think tank for 22 years. It was great work. It was, I feel very grateful for my time with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. I was director, so a lot of my time was in administration and fundraising and, everything that comes with being an executive director. I was already working on the climate file, but not full-time on the climate file. I juggled a number of files. And like I said before, I was becoming increasingly alarmed, wanting to spend more of my time on climate. But also when you work for a left-wing think tank, you are forever in that space between, here are these reports that we publish outlining what should be done, and here's what our politicians seemed willing to or prepared to entertain. So that's true across a whole range of areas, but it's particularly jarring when it comes to climate. And I just had a feeling like I wanted to dedicate my time more fully to the climate emergency.
Well, it's a noble effort, and we need more folks like you on that. Something that comes to mind, quite often we think about, these brilliant people like yourself or Greta or David Suzuki, who are really making a change in the space. And there are times where I'm concerned that by seeing these, celebrity activists, the general population can almost think, you know what? They're doing an amazing job. I don't need to do as much because we've got these remarkable people carrying the weight of this. When our listeners read your book, what are you hoping that they take away that can equip them to actually start making change themselves?
Well, first of all, I don't know that what you just articulated is all that common a thought in terms of what holds people back. I think what's more common is a feeling of hopelessness, that nothing's to be done. Or on the flip side, sometimes our politics is very clever at giving the impression that they are doing something more meaningful than they actually are. And everyone also feels very isolated. That's why, to zero in on Greta in particular, when I think about what are these transformative events that really shift the terrain, I think about these remarkable student-led mobilizations inspired by her that happened just before COVID hit us, here in Canada in September 2019, a few months before the first lockdown, we saw a youth-led day of protest that was the largest day of protest in Canadian history, right ahead of a federal election. It certainly played a key part in changing how this whole conversation is unfolding. But to directly answer your question, I'm heartened that the people who read the book find it an unusually hopeful book, notwithstanding how dire the subject matter is. Because like me, I'm trying to excavate from this 80-year-old story of the war this reminder that we've done this before. We have mobilized in common cause across class and race and gender to confront an existential threat. And in the process, we surprised ourselves by what we were capable of accomplishing. I'm trying to do that in a way that isn't, Pollyanna, because the truth is, any of us who follow the IPCC reports walks a razor's edge between hope and despair about whether or not we can actually do this in time. But I'd like to remind readers and listeners in talks that I give that same ambiguity was true for the 1 million+ Canadians who mobilized and enlisted in World War II, because they didn't know either if they were going to win. We know in the rearview mirror, we know how their story ended, but they didn't, and they did it anyway. So I'm trying to marshal that kind of spirit, and provide this example. Ironically, the book was entirely written before the pandemic, but came out during the pandemic. And the pandemic, in its own way, also offers this example of how quickly we're capable of pivoting in the face of a recognized emergency. So there's all kinds of interesting parallels across all of these emergencies. It's not a foregone conclusion that we will do what we need to do in time, not by any stretch. But I'm not ready to throw in the towel yet, and I hope that comes through for readers.
The piece that I struggle with is in the Second World War, when we think about any country and how they operationalized, there was a very clear enemy. And when you think about climate change, it just has so many tentacles, being fueled on so many fronts: corrupt governments, food production, transportation, the militaries, like unknown consumption of energy. So how do you go about tackling these various sticky tentacles, and how do you make a clear enemy? Yeah,
it's a good question. And when you compare these different emergencies, there are similarities and there are differences. And at one level, the curse of climate change compared to the war, compared to COVID, is that it moves in slow motion. It makes it very easy for our politics to kick the can down the road. That said, I want to press back on one kind of assumption in your question, because I think many of us kind of loosely look back at that World War II history, and we think, oh, well, back then the threat was clear and present. Everyone understood. Everyone was ready to rally. Not true, especially if you were here in Canada. The threat, if you were in Europe, the threat was fairly clear and present. If you were in Canada, it was on the other side of two oceans. And the public was not at all keen about doing this. And so it took work, it took leadership to bring the public on board. It took ubiquitous and consistent messaging, and it took certain events, that galvanized people, like the fall of France. Now, in our case, in the present, extreme weather events are those events. Now, the challenge is they don't happen everywhere all at once, right? Different pockets of the population. 1 year Quebec experiences this devastating flooding, and then 1 year BC experiences this horrific and deadly heat wave. So we don't all experience it together, and that makes it additionally challenging. But here's the interesting thing, Aaron, when you dig into the polls, is I would actually say that the public the terrain has shifted. in terms of people's understanding of the emergency. And that a majority of the public does understand climate to be an emergency, and in many respects is ahead of our politics, both in terms of their understanding of the threat and their willingness to consider truly bold policy responses. And we're kind of stuck in this awkward period that won't last, but it's coming.
Which tentacles do we need to tackle first? How do we triage and rank order? I mean, I imagine we have the data, and I imagine that there actually is a database that I could go to right now that would tell me this information. But I'm wondering, from your perspective, from a climate emergency perspective, where do we start? Well,
first, let me answer this two different ways. So first of all, I always balk a little bit about like, what should we do first? The thing about approaching something in a wartime footing is, you don't win wars partially. You win them or you lose them. And 𝘈 𝘎𝘰𝘥 has an expression about climate change that resonates greatly with me, which is to win slowly when it comes to climate change is to lose. It's just not how it works. So we actually have to hit all these fronts at once. We can't take them in stages. That said, we can and should certainly focus with great vigor. We know where the main sources of greenhouse gas emissions are. They are the extraction and processing of fossil fuels, the subsequent burning of those fossil fuels in our modes of transportation and in our homes and buildings. Those things alone are the vast majority of greenhouse gas emissions. And so we all need to tackle those things, and we need to tackle them both through our own choices. But if there's a core message in the book, it's that this is an inherently political project and moment. That's the thing about emergencies like wars or climate. We don't win them alone. We don't win them as individuals. They're inherently collective. Mm-hmm. And that means we have to be politically organizing to galvanize our politics into emergency with us. So that's some, I think that provides some guidance to where we should focus our efforts. In the book and in the work that I do with the climate emergency unit, I take a somewhat different approach as well, which is, if this is a political project, the question is, how do you know when a government is actually in emergency mode? And you measure that less by what are they doing on transportation, what are they doing on buildings, and it's more about an overall framework. And I offer up 6 markers of emergency mode. Here's how you know. You know when it spends what it takes to win. You know when it's creating new institutions to get the job done, like new crown enterprises and that kind of thing. You know when they move, this is a key one, marker 3, you know when they move from voluntary and incentive-based policies to mandatory measures. Maybe we should come back to that one. Number 4, you know when they tell the truth. They tell the truth about the severity of the crisis and what we have to do to confront it, and they're consistent about that. So each time a government approves a new fossil fuel infrastructure project or extraction project, they are, in fact, telling an untruth. Number 5, you leave no one behind. So you connect it with that commitment to just transition for workers in that area and income supports for people, so people can know that this is going to unfold in a way that is fair and equitable. And number 6 is around the role of Indigenous leadership and the assertion of Indigenous rights and title, which, as our politics dithers and dodges, keeps buying us time by keeping more of these projects and their fossil fuels in the ground. Those are my 6 markers of when you know that we're actually headed in the right direction.
I love those markers. So intuitive and also so memorable. Did you come up with those?
Yeah, well, I did. And they sort of bubbled, when the book first came out a year and a half ago, when you're doing interviews like this and writing summary articles, I actually have like a battle plan in the book, which is 16 points. No one's going to let you do 16 points. So you start trying to whittle these down, and eventually you land with this shortened list of markers of this is when you know.
And have we ever, or have you ever seen a political party or candidate propose a plan that actually checks off number one of spend what it takes to win?
Yes. So there's certainly candidates out there. First of all, you and I are both in Canada. So let's just note that within the G7, our own country performs the worst. Like on actually reducing emissions and tackling this in a way that starts to practice what I'm getting at, every other G7 country outperforms us. But none of those G7 countries hit all the markers. And I can't think of any country that fully hits all of them. But there are, and I'm going to say something that's accepted as biased as it is. Vancouver has a genuine climate emergency plan. The province doesn't. The federal government doesn't. Now, I say I'm biased because my wife's the Vancouver city councillor who moved the climate emergency motion, out of which came this Vancouver climate emergency plan. For a municipal level government, they certainly have a plan to spend what it takes to win. They're creating new institutions, neighborhood energy utilities, things like that. But let's come back to marker 3 that I flagged before, because this is a key one. In any city, generally speaking, more than half of the greenhouse gas emissions are from the natural gas we burn in our homes and buildings. What Vancouver has done on that front is that they have said, as of this year, like this past January, no new buildings can use fossil fuels for space and water heating. And they've set a regulatory system in place so that basically by 2025, when your furnace or boiler goes and needs to be replaced, you won't be able to replace it with gas. Those 2 measures alone are going to drive about half of the GHG reductions for the next 10 years in this city. Those are emergency measures. They're years ahead of the targets that the feds or the province are talking about, and they communicate that sense of emergency. So whereas if you look at our federal and provincial policies, they have long lists of measures. But what they almost all have in common is that they're voluntary. We're trying to incentivize our way to victory. Encourage people, send price signals, give them tax cuts, give them rebates. We never would have won World War II by incentivizing our way to victory.
Everyone is screaming and shouting Tesla right now. I mean, I'd love one too. Recently, I've been hearing a lot more chatter about just electric vehicles and lithium-ion batteries actually paying a huge toll on the environment just in the cost of mining and getting the resources required. What are your thoughts on electric cars and those batteries? Well,
we do need to electrify everything.
Mm-hmm.
And batteries are going to be a big part of that, not just for cars. So we do need to figure out how to go about meeting those mineral needs with as little environmental damage as possible. But there will be environmental damage. Everything has environmental. There's no get out of jail free card here.
Mm-hmm.
That said, there's lots of evidence out there that the mining that's needed for this electrification revolution doesn't hold a candle to fossil fuel extraction in terms of its environmental damage. So I'm not trying to let it off the hook. I'm just saying, give it a choice. One is deeply more damaging. And so we do need to electrify our cars. And I have done that, not with the Tesla, with a cheaper alternative. Our family has a Leaf and an electric bike.
Nice.
The electric bike is a game changer. in terms of our ability to get around the city as a family, and its environmental footprint is so much less than any of these other options. And yet we don't encourage and incentivize electric bikes in nearly the same way we do for electric cars. But here's the main point. When we really embrace, there is a danger when people think about where we go with climate change, that of messaging that says just electrify everything, swap out everything you do with fossil fuels with electric, and otherwise you don't have to change anything. That's all we have to do. And that's not true. We do have to change an awful lot of things. And when it comes to transportation, what matters just as much, if not more, than moving to EV vehicles is actually changing how we get around, how we design our cities and communities so that for the most part, people can actually walk or roll everywhere they need to go. And where, in fact, it is an easy choice for people to choose electric public transit and realize that they don't need a car, period, to live the good life that they're looking for. That's actually what we need to do.
Mm-hmm. I'm with you. Just on that note, I don't use a car at all, and I don't even have an electric bicycle. Just pedal.
Right on. Good for you.
No, but the electric bike is something that I would absolutely look into and have looked into. They're fantastic. And
the key thing with the electric bike, by the way, I mean, we schlepped our kids around pre-electric bike and getting them to daycare and stuff. But there's no doubt that in terms of being able to reach the entire city with a kid, the electric bike is huge.
Right. I mean, I feel like between electric bikes and honestly car sharing like Evo, you really don't need
You've
vehicles.
met your need. Yeah.
That's what I do.
And we need cities. So we need those systems in place, and we need cities designed in a way that allows that to happen.
Mm-hmm. Since we've been just naming quite a few different brands, would now be a good option for you to continue with your thought on various?
Oh yes, you're giving me an opening for a little chat, I think, that we had off air.
Sure am.
Yeah, well, I only noticed just before we started the interview that a number of episodes of your show are sponsored by RBC, the bank, and I balked when I realized that, but you and I agreed we should just talk about it, which I think is the answer. There's an awful lot of greenwashing going on. So let's just name RBC's role within the topic that we're talking about. They are fueling climate gas. They are the number one financier investor in fossil fuels in Canada, and they are number 5 globally. And a whole lot of that has happened since the Paris Agreement. Like RBC alone has increased its investments in fossil fuels by over $200 billion since the Paris Agreement was signed. They are also one of the lead funders of Coastal GasLink gas pipeline that is proposed for northern British Columbia over the objections of the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs. So without their consent, and where the RCMP are forcibly removing people from their territory in violation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. So RBC has a problem. Now, they are among the banks that have signed on to these net zero by 2050 pledges. And what can I tell you? I wouldn't take that to the bank. I think you got to follow the money. And when you follow the money, they're not there yet.
Well said, and truly appreciate you letting me and our listeners know. And that one's for you, RBC. I guess the other question I have is, one of our major sponsors, which isn't listed, is Shell Corporation.
Let's talk about them too.
No, I'm fully joking about that.
Okay. Okay, great.
Seth, something that you speak about in A Good War is the role of indigenous people in the wartime context and now in the face of climate change. And what is this role, in your opinion, and how did you come to understand it?
Bit of a dual role, I would say. I mean, one is a leadership role just in the transition. And if you look across Canada at all of the exciting renewable energy projects that are happening, about a fifth of them are happening under Indigenous leadership. Far in excess of Indigenous people's share of the population. But the second piece of it is around the very assertion of Indigenous rights and title, and how that fits into meeting this emergency moment. I try to make the point in the book with a story. As I was writing the book in 2019, I was listening to the radio one morning, and a news item came across the radio about the death of Louis Levi Oakes, the last of the Mohawk code talkers, in his 90s. The code talkers were Indigenous soldiers who were tasked with using their own languages to communicate information among Allied forces. Because what was happening in the war is that the Nazis and the Japanese kept breaking the Allied codes. And there's a certain point, the Americans discovered that if you had two Navajo soldiers communicating in Navajo, they couldn't break it. And ultimately, Indigenous soldiers got recruited from about 33 North American Indigenous languages were employed, including many from what's known as Canada, including many Mohawk and Tlingit and Cree, Ojibwe. When Louis Levi Oakes died, there was these remarkable stories. Like, they had been sworn to secrecy, so he waited till he was in his 80s before telling his family what he had done. And then he got the Congressional Silver Medal in the States and special awards from the Assembly of First Nations and the House of Commons. But as I learned about this, it just struck me that there was this incredible irony, right? Like, these languages, North America, Canada and the United States had spent generations trying to expunge these languages from the earth, literally beating them out of children in residential schools, only to then discover in the war that they were the unbreakable code. That's what they were called, the unbreakable code, and credited with victories in certain key battles, particularly in the Pacific. And I thought, isn't that interesting? Like, because if you fast forward to the present, in the same way, our two countries have spent decades systematically ignoring and abusing Indigenous rights and title. And yet over and over and over again, it is the assertion of rights and title that keeps kind of coming to our rescue, buying us time as our mainstream politics dithers and dodges. And it's so incoherent in its approach on climate. These Indigenous-led efforts to block fossil fuel extraction are buying us time. And to put a number on that, just a number of months ago, the Indigenous Environment Network and Oil Change International actually did a report where they tried to tally up the GHGs of all of these Indigenous-led efforts to block fossil and slow fossil fuel infrastructure that led to those GHGs staying in the ground. And they calculated it to be equivalent to about 25% of total North American emissions. I mean, we
total
are...
as in forever, like from the 1800s?
No. Like in any annual sense, it would be equivalent to about 25%. So
still huge.
It's huge. Like, we should have immense gratitude for what's happening there. And the more those Indigenous rights and title is recognized and respected, the more we will get ourselves onto the path that the IPCC urgently says we have to.
Are there any? There's a book that recently came out called Code Talkers, is it right?
I don't know about the book. There's actually a movie, a Hollywood movie with Adam Beach, Nicolas Cage that came out some years ago about it.
Nicolas Cage.
Yeah.
I just watched a film the other night called Coda. Have you seen that?
Yeah.
It kind of blew my mind.
Yeah, it was great.
Side note question. You're obviously doing a ton. When do you find time to write a book? Are you most productive in the morning, evening?
Well, I'm not a writer exactly. So I spent 22 years at a think tank writing policy reports. They were good, not exactly gripping reading, but good. And when I wrote the book, I basically wrote it in a single year in 2019, and it came out in 2020. And when I wrote the book, it's all I did. I wasn't doing anything else. I'm one of these writers that, I'm easily distracted and easy to procrastinate with other things. So I just needed to be focused on that. And just to transition to what I'm doing now, once the book came out, the book is chock full of what I would consider true emergency ideas. And I started to meet with political leaders across the country. Funny thing when you have a book is you can get a meeting. On the flip side, you can only get so far when you're just a guy with a book. And realizing, having left the CCPA a couple of years earlier, I needed an institutional home again in order to build some political muscle, some drumbeat behind these ideas to put the pressure on our political leadership. And David Suzuki and Tara Cullis gave me a home with the David Suzuki Institute, and we created this thing called the Climate Emergency Unit. So I now work with a team of 8 people across the country. And the model is to create coalition tables of the willing, we call them. Coalition tables provincially, sectorally, nationally, behind the emergency ideas in the book, so that we can get as many organizations, particularly from outside the environmental movement, faith institutions, arts and culture institutions, joining in sounding the emergency alarm and telling political leaders, this is what we mean by emergency, this is what we're looking for. So that's how I spend my time now. And my only writing is I write a biweekly column for Canada's National Observer, which are really another way of seeding emergency ideas.
And if our listeners want to check out this column, where do they go?
Well, you can just go to Canada's National Observer, and I'm listed among the columnists. People can access any of this both through my own personal website, which is just sethklein.ca, and there's links to the columns and to the Climate Emergency Unit, or you can go to climateemergencyunit.ca and see the work and the campaigns that we're part of, and either route will lead you to all of this.
We'll be sure to make sure that our listeners get those links, and we'll include all of them in the description of the episode as well. With your work with the David Suzuki Foundation and
the David Suzuki Institute, I should clarify.
Sorry,
so it's slightly different because it's a nonprofit, but it's not a charity, and that's partly by design. That because this is a political moment and a political project, and so the unit will endorse candidates who we consider to be real climate champions, and that's something charities can't do.
Are there any candidates that excite you at the moment?
Well, in the last federal election, we endorsed a number of climate champions. In fact, one member of our team, 𝘈 𝘕𝘰𝘥 was a candidate, and a very exciting candidate who came within about 400 votes of winning in Vancouver Granville, in a riding that was considered a write-off by her own party. She was running as the New Democrat candidate, but it's magic when somebody decides to truly run on a bold, audacious climate justice platform, and to see all of these people, young people and older people, just gravitate to her campaign And in defiance of all predictions, I mean, frankly, I think if the election campaign had been 2 days longer, she wouldn't be a member of our team. She'd be a member of parliament. Oh, and let me just say too, I'd be remiss if I didn't say, my wife is a political climate champion in the city of Vancouver who moved this emergency. And I think you identify these people in particular by that fourth marker, the willingness to tell the truth, even when it's unpopular or hard to hear about the emergency moment that we're in. And I think people actually welcome that. So the champs are out there.
Right. When thinking about your wife, for example, and if someone's out there thinking, hey, I want to get more involved in Vancouver-based or Canadian politics, what sort of things would you recommend they look for in a candidate?
Well, I think you're looking for candidates who, frankly, are ready to ignore the advice of the conventional punditry and political advisor class who tells you, don't say this, because there's too many people who won't want to hear that. I remember, so when Christine, my wife, first brought forward, let me give you the timing. She was elected to office in October for the first time of 2019. And later that month, the IPCC report came out that gave us 12 years or 11 years at that point. 2018, and gave us 12 years to have our emissions. And so that became her first motion for Vancouver to declare a climate emergency. And that motion gave the city staff 90 days to come up with a new city climate plan that would align with the IPCC targets. And it included a bunch of bold measures that we talked about earlier. And when it was just ready to go public and she was asked, like, wow, there's some really kind of controversial things in here. Did you poll on these things? Her answer was, no, it never occurred to her to poll on such things. Why would you do that? It had to be done. And she understood her job to be getting it passed in a council that was very politically diverse, right? There's no party has a majority on this council, and they're all over the political map. And yet those motions did pass. And in fact, the early ones passed unanimously. And to give some further credit here in terms of how is it that across this politically diverse council, these motions on the climate emergency passed unanimously. Some of it is, because my wife is very skilled at her job. But what she would say is that in particular, it was about dozens of high school students who skipped school each time these votes happened, who rallied outside, who spoke before council, who filled the galleries. And they basically made it politically impossible for even the conservative councillors to vote no. So there is this interesting combination of some dedicated senior staff who were really committed to this, a political champion, which you also need, who in this case happened to be my wife, and the outside pressure of groups, particularly these youth-led groups, all combining to actually give our city a genuine emergency plan.
It continues to inspire and amaze me just how much our youth are able to make significant change. And I was speaking to Jane Goodall the other day, and she was talking about how they're investing all their efforts in the Roots and Shoots movement, right? To enable and to grow this grassroots leadership. And what I'm wondering about with you is, for youth, but also for the general population who are listening to this, what's the first step in us kind of transitioning or changing our journey or our habits? If there's one thing that we can do to make a difference, if we're feeling that sense of hopelessness, like this issue is just too big and we don't know where to start, where is point one? Where do we begin?
You're doing that thing again where you're saying, what's the one thing? But look, there are the things we all need to do in our personal lives to lower our emissions. So we have to change how we get around, and we have to change how we heat our homes. Those are the two key things. But my point, my core message in the work I do now and in the book is that if we are hoping that enough people and households and businesses will voluntarily do what I just said, we're fried. It has to be state-led. It ultimately needs a combination of carrots and sticks. The carrots are the supports, the money, and the sticks are the mandates. You need them both. And that means the one thing is that you have to engage in a political project. You either have to back those political champions. You have to put pressure on them, organize with others to put pressure on them all the time. And if none of that works, you have to run yourself. If this isn't going to be state-led, we're in big trouble. And that's the key lesson out of the war. To truly achieve speed and scale, it has to be state-led, right? State-led through the money, through the creation of new crown enterprises, and through the mandates. In World War II, let me give you this thought, okay? Pearl Harbor, this is more of an American example, but it illustrates the point. Pearl Harbor happened in December of 1941. In February of 1942, 2 months later, the last civilian automobile rolled off the assembly line in Detroit, and for the next 4 years, their production and sale was effectively illegal. Now, all those factories were busy pumping out something else for the war effort. All those workers were working hard. But that didn't happen through the goodwill or patriotism of the big three automakers. That happened because they were ordered. That's what it means to be in emergency mode.
And so on that note, what is the single most impactful thing that someone listening to this episode right now can actually do? One link to take them to, one spot? Well, first of all, go to the climate-emergency-unit.ca if you're in Canada. You'll see there the 6 markers of emergency that I talked about earlier. So the key, I invite people to use that as a tool for both organizing politically, assessing political platforms of candidates and parties, but also those 6 markers apply just as equally to any large institution, a faith institution, a labor union, a company, you name it. All of these institutions in our own lives, a school board, a post-secondary institution. Are they spending what it takes to win? Are they creating new institutions to galvanize the change that's needed? Are they moving to mandatory measures? Are they telling the truth? Are they doing this in a just way that leaves no one behind? Are they centering Indigenous leadership and rights? Every large institution can and should follow those markers. And I invite people to use it as a tool to organize with others in those institutions in your own life, to say, here's the thing about emergency, Aaron. Emergencies in the end need to look and sound and feel like emergencies. Is there anything about our current provincial or federal government's approach or that looks and sounds and feels like an emergency to you? Or if you go to your faith institution or you go to your post-secondary institution, does it look and sound and feel like an emergency to you? And yet, I'm quite certain that if you went to a faith institution in the war, or you were a university student during the war, everything about the experience told you, communicated to you that you were doing so at a time of emergency. So we're not there yet, but I'm offering up a framework of tools here, of markers, to try to shift our institutions into that mode. Seth, I've never heard this information presented in such a digestible and clear way. I'm personally going to be spending a fair bit of time navigating the site, well, more than I already have, and I'll encourage our listeners to do the same. It's been such a pleasure speaking with you today. Thank you so much for taking the time, for sharing your learnings, for sharing your advice. And I look forward to continuing the conversation with you.
Thanks, Aaron.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Impact in the 21st Century by Simbi Foundation. We hope you found listening to it as meaningful as we did. If you enjoyed listening, please consider subscribing to us on whichever platform you're listening from, and leave us a review or a comment to let us know your favorite moment. Or feel free to recommend a guest for future episodes. Simbi Foundation builds bright boxes, solar-powered classrooms built from shipping containers that provide educational technology, digital learning material, and sustainable energy through a microgrid to entire schools and communities. If you'd like to learn more, feel free to visit simbifoundation.org. Thanks for taking the time to listen, and we look forward to bringing you more stories of positive impact in the next episode.